Please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, John Yearwood, Editorial Director of Diversity and Culture at Politico.
Good afternoon, Rabat, and good afternoon to the Atlantic Dialogues family. It's good to be back here in Rabat. I'll start by telling you a secret. This session we're about to do is a session that I've been thinking about for a while, and when the good people at the Policy Center called and asked me if I can do it, I was thrilled because it's something that I've been thinking about, whether Africa should be navigating alone or not. And I suspect many of you in the audience have had some of the same questions. So we have an amazing panel that's going to explore that issue, among others, over the next hour. And we'll start by calling them out. First, Natalie Della Palma from the Mo Abraham Foundation, please. Musi Mamani from the President of Build One South Africa. Peter Pham, who's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. And last but certainly not least, Andres Rosenthal, a friend of the Atlantic Dialogues, who is president of Rosenthal and Associates. But first, let's hear a video that has been prepared. We'll watch that, and then I'll come back on the other side.
Priorities. Collective voice. Through initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, the African Union's reform agenda, and regional security mechanisms, Africa is building resilience, yet still confronting the limits of dependency. How does Africa pursue strategic agency in a global system dominated by self-interest? Can continental integration offset external fragmentation and dependency? Is Africa's quest for a stronger voice in global governance attainable in an age of transactional politics?
Thank you very much. So the table has been set. Let's start by getting you engaged right off the bat. I have two questions for you. First, whether you think that Africa should be navigating alone. If you can open your iPhones, iPads, and sort of answer that question, I think that would give us a sense that it will help inform our conversation that we're having. And while you do that, I think I should go ahead and start with Musi. What do you think? Hopefully, you're probably not necessarily influenced by what you're seeing on the screen, but what do you think? Should Africa be navigating alone?
I was looking at the poll, and when you are involved in politics, any poll gets you a bit nervous. So, so I guess I won't talk to that. I think if I think about it carefully, COVID was an interesting time globally. It spoke to a threat that the entire globe first faced up to. And therefore the question at the time became, if you wanted to answer the same question during the same time, you'd ask it and say, should Africa have gone at it alone? And who else is going at it alone? And so for me, the response to the question is, sometimes those who purport the idea of going at it alone lose track of the fact that we are so integrated in a globalized universe that they tend to want to suggest isolation. I want to argue this point, that rather than have a discussion about isolation, it's about insulation. which then asks the question, what are the things Africa ought to be doing that when there are global events, whether COVID, whether AI, whether climate change, whether all of those, how does Africa insulate itself in order to be able to respond to its own self-interests? And what I would like to propose off the bat is there are key areas that we desperately need to be paying profound attention to if we're going to achieve a sense of insulation in global headwinds. The first is Africa must attend to the question of its own debt trap. Because in the main, in other African jurisdictions, debt is held in other places, which means that the notion of insulation when there are global headwinds becomes even harder, because I can speak about South Africa. For every 1 rand that goes into the fiscus, 21 cents of it eventually ends up at debt servicing costs, which crowds out the effect of other expenditure. And what was interesting about COVID is that South Africa pre-COVID had a debt level of close just over 50%, and now suddenly post-COVID, we're projecting a peak of about 77%. The second is we live in a digitized universe. My children watch Netflix and it debuts at the same time as any child in the US. So in the midst of all of that, of digital environment, it's not only about what television we consume, it's the reality of the fact that we can work anywhere, transact with anyone. And I think Africa needs to build its own digital infrastructure in order that we can enhance our intra-African trade. Third is the nature of the dialogue we are having with ourselves. I think as Africans, we've felt for far too long, and I say this as a proud African who is buoyed about this continent, that our dialogue can't be of victimhood, post-colonial, that sort of feeling of we are the last. We have to arrive at the table with a new renewed sense of confidence. We have minerals of the future. In response to climate, we most affect. But I think Africans, we have the demographic dividend going forward. And I think we need to be able to come at the table with that sense of confidence. And then the last thing I would say is we need to uphold our sense of democracy. Because in many ways, as the world is starting to see in the democracy index decreases taking place, Africans cannot allow ourselves for our democracy to be externalized. Because the great risk of that is that we could run the risk where, in the same way as minerals were taken out of the continent without being beneficiated in the continent elsewhere, we run the same risk with labor, in the sense that you could take labor out of the continent. What Africa needs to do is to be able to be very clear about its own economic pathways. That's why initiatives like the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, a digitized Africa, an integrated Africa, that makes it possible for us to be able to sit back and go, as we maximize those opportunities and insulate ourselves from headwinds, our self-interest need to be preserved in order that we interact in a globalized universe. Africa can stand not as the dark continent, but as the continent rising. So I think for me, I'm much more buoyed about that conversation rather than isolationists. I'm much more inclined in the sense that we can be confident about the future that's coming.
Terrific. There's a lot there to unpack. One of the things that you talked about, though, is the language of victimhood. Do you see that changing in Africa?
I think as a new set of leaders come on board, that is beginning to shift in its language. Secondly, I think we're starting to really confront the question of multilateralism in a different way. There are new alliances being formed, which a bit like a building of a new confidence that's starting to arise. I think thirdly, as economies are shifting, I think Professor Lopez highlighted this point, some of the fastest growing economies are in the continent. Some of the minerals that we need for a new economy that's green, that's renewable, sit within the continent. I think young people in a continent that has an average age, people put different figures, 23, maybe I can speak about my own country, there's a new confidence that says, as much as Africa has got something to learn, it's also got something to teach in the global dialogue. And I think one of the things that was, for me, much of a shock, even during the COVID years, was that when our scientists in South Africa were discovering Omicron, there was a global sense of, well, these are South African scientists, dismiss them. Whereas I think had we built the new confidence to say, actually, we will back our scientists, we'll back our data, we will be able to raise the appropriate capital to build our own pharmacology in the continent and actually execute on projects that aggregate the capital that already sits within the continent, I think that confidence will be emboldened going forward. So I certainly think, previously you'd look around and think the grass is certainly greener on the other side. I think more and more younger Africans are starting to think we should make sure that our grass is getting greener, not because it's full of manure, but because I think there's a lot of positive things that are taking place on the continent.
Yep. Before I move on to Natalie, I want to ask the audience actually to get engaged again with us. And we're talking about the language, how people see Africa. There's a question about what comes to mind when you think of Africa and you hear the word Africa. If you can, we're doing a word cloud. If you can go into your iPads and iPhone, would like to know what you think about when you hear the word Africa. Some people may say victim, which is, you said actually is changing, potential, among others. As these words come up, Natalie, and I'm going to go around asking everyone the whole question that I started with, whether you think Africa should be navigating alone.
Well, if you allow me, I'd like to say a few words of the session. And the first one is navigating. I think it's fair to say that we are definitely entered a world of uncertainty, and this is the direction of travel, be it climate change, pandemics, conflicts. The world is uncertain. And I think that these challenges ignore borders or development levels, and they are shared by everybody. And it means that the global order is not able to address these challenges. So navigating is indeed the best way to travel in this very uncertain world. What does navigating mean? It means that we need to do with the quality of the sea, the currents, the winds, the headwinds you were mentioning. We have to show agility. So there is no norms and there is no global order that can prevent weather conditions or whatever. So I really think that navigating, and it is a word that has been used very frequently over the last 2 days in our discussion, navigating is really what we need to do. Now, when we talk about self-interest, global order, and it may seem that this is a bit contradictory, but indeed I don't think it's the case. Why would interest be bad? I mean, I think it's important, interest. I think that we need to consider this interest. People often say that the best deals are the ones that are based on very diverging interests and agendas to begin with. And if you allow me even to go a bit further, I do think that relationship and partnerships based on interest do entail trust, probably more than common history or shared values. The only thing is, this interest needs to be listened to, heard, and shared by everybody, including the less endowed or the less vulnerable. I'll take one example, the climate debate. You talked about COVID. I will talk about climate. Up to now, the global climate debate has been mainly led by already developed countries, who are the most responsible for the current situation due to their former very carbon-intensive development model, which means that their main point were mitigation. Their main focus imposed to everybody. Basically, they are leading people to save the planet to the expense of its people. In Africa, half the population of the continent still doesn't have access to energy, 600 million people. Without energy, no health, no education, no development. So it means that if we want to have an interest-based conversation on climate, we need to take into consideration the interest of access to energy and the interest of these less developed countries. We need to prioritize adaptation as much as mitigation. And we need to consider also, and we come to Africa, that Africa can be a major stakeholder when it comes to bringing solutions to the climate debate, given its green assets. Now, Africa alone Africa is not alone, and Africa hasn't been alone. I mean, there has been multiple partners going to work with and in Africa already for a very long time. And I'm not talking about Russia and China alone. Turkey, Japan, Gulf states, and Gulf states are working in Africa at many levels: critical minerals, AI, conflict mediation. These people are not coming to Africa out, once again, of common history or shared values. They are coming out of interest. So it is an interest-based new order. Africa is not alone because Africa is huge. It's a huge continent. 1.5 billion people, and Carlos Lopez was saying that this is the market of tomorrow, already the market of today somehow. 54 countries with different geographies, histories, trajectories, agendas, interests. What is true is that more and more we see that there are bilateral relationships and partnerships that are building. Recently at the last AU-EU summit in Rwanda, it was interesting to see that the conversation was almost as much on bilateral relationship between some member states in Africa, some member states in Europe, not the same coalitions. I think it's fair to say that we have entered this world of volatile, different coalitions, depending on the interest at stakes. So this is important. Last but not least, Africa is not alone, but in order to navigate efficiently, Africa must navigate as a team. And I think it's very important for Africa to articulate a common position when it comes to global debates or global challenges. Once again, when I come to climate, the first African Climate Summit in Nairobi, the second in Addis, were extremely important when it came to articulating Africa's case, making the case of adaptation, making the case of access to energy, making the case of Africa's potential when it comes to climate solutions. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thanks for your intervention, Natalie. Appreciate it. Let's move to Peter. Peter, there are about 20% of the people in the audience think that Africa should go it alone. Why are they wrong?
Well, first of all, look, thank you for the session, John and the organizers. I think it's a very interesting, although I do have some differences with both the video that was shown and the questions posed, because there's an implicit tone in there that somehow self-interest is wrong or self-interest is bad. And I agree fully with Natalie. Actually, self-interest is the basis of classic international relations theory. Maybe I'm old school, but I'm a student of Morgenthau and of Mearsheimer, and it's the basis of relationships, articulated self-interest, as long as you're transparent and sharing it. So I think, if anything, and going back to Morgenthau, at the very beginning of the era of independence, the challenge for Africa was that Africa's interests weren't being defined in Africa. They were defined in Europe, the colonial powers. And now, several generations later, is an opportunity to define those interests in the continent. And so I think that self-interest should be embraced. And with that self-interest, the strategic agency that comes with first thinking through what your interests are strategically, and then what assets you have to pursue those interests, what assets you need, what partners you need to go forward. Now, where I would differ slightly with Natalie is I also think that we also should not let the best be the enemy of the good. If your goal is to have one voice in Africa, let's be honest, the Americas do not speak with one voice. Europe, despite the European Union, does not speak with one voice, even on issues like Ukraine, which many Europeans say is existential to them, does not speak with one voice. And so to expect Africa to do that is letting as they say, le mieux d'être l'ennemi du bien. And I think what we need to do is, I think we're in an era where multilateralism is, I think someone said yesterday, it's the multilateralism a la carte. It's going to be shifting coalitions. And so this is where the strategic exercise, the hard work of defining interests, of articulating them, of building coalitions to pursue them. And I think my advice as someone who is not an African, but who's devoted my entire career, I hate to admit how many decades it's been. I'm now, qualified as, I think, in most African countries as an elder anymore nowadays, to think about, in this context, to think about those coalitions that will be built and are realistically to be achievable in real time. A good example, we're sitting here in Morocco, I will call out, is the Royal Initiative on the Atlantic, to give access to this Atlantic community that we're talking about. I'm old enough to have been around these conversations on the Atlantic community when they were just starting, and it was, and my friend across the way was there as well, when this was a dream. Well, the dream has now become a common vision, and now this opens the door for those who are not geographically on the Atlantic to have access to this wider community. So it's become a common vision that needs to be actualized, and that actualization will occur, I think, with a process that's sustainable. If we're waiting for the free trade area to come together before this happens, then we're build with building blocks, and the building blocks can, and look at the other examples from other parts of the world. In Europe, it started with a coal and steel community, and it's now evolved to the union, and who knows what the next iteration is going to be. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to be embraced as a friend of mine, to be embraced by the continent, identify your interests, identify how those are to be achieved, begin building those coalitions, and I think the future is very bright if we approach it just like any other place in the world. The same rules of international relations, and they're age-old rules, they're as old as human society, will still apply going forward, just in different form.
Great, thank you, Peter. Before I get to Abe, I just want to let folks know that we'll be coming to get audience questions here soon, so have your questions ready. So Abe, you're in a part of the world where you've got a president who has sort of been able to figure out how to work with the American president, according to the New York Times and others. What's your thinking about, whether this whole Africa question about going it alone?
Well, I think I took the question and the title of this plenary to be also directed towards the question of the realpolitik in which we are living today. That is a conflict in trade and economics between at least two, if not three, major players on the global stage. And what role does, and it's not just Africa, Latin America, other areas, how can they survive within that reality? So I think what all of the rest of the panel, the rest of our panelists have said is perfectly correct. We live in a world which, although lots of people, analysts have killed and buried globalization, we're still living in an extremely globalized world. And if you ask whether any country or any group of countries can go it alone in that globalized world, the answer has to be no, and I think we saw it clearly in the first poll. We all have Netflix in South Africa, in Mexico, in Morocco. We cannot at this stage in the evolution of international realpolitik be able to say that anybody can go it alone. The question really is, can the group of African states, 50 plus, be able to find areas like COVID or other potential crises to navigate through those on its own as a group? And I think the experience we've had in other groupings in other parts of the world, the answer also has to be no. It is very difficult. During COVID, where do you get the vaccine? The vaccines came from Europe, they came from the US. In Mexico, the government tried to create its own vaccine. And the last I heard, 5 years after COVID, is that they're still working on it. I don't see the necessity or the convenience of being able to say we can do it on our own. And that goes for quite a few issues within this globalized world. You mentioned Mexico's president as at least according to the New York Times, able to deal with Mr. Trump better than others have been able to do it. I think that is a media-inspired vision. Mexico has not done any better than any other country in terms of tariffs, in terms of Mr. Trump's ability to get under your skin. He continues to say that he may not continue the trilateral USMCA agreement and so on. But what I do think is that those countries that have been successful, and this holds true for Europe, Africa, Latin America, that have been successful in dealing with this particular administration in Washington, are those that have leverage in other areas in which you can balance the imbalance of a relationship. So whether it's countries that have critical minerals that the US wants, or semiconductor technology that the US wants, or anything else, those are the ones that have the leverage to be able to deal with this particular administration. We were listening in the previous panels earlier about whether Trumpism is going to be there past Mr. Trump. And, I'm one who feels that the very nature of what is happening in the United States, and maybe you know much more about it than I do, but is not just a Trump issue. It's an issue of having gone through cycles within the United States of isolationism versus globalization, of looking abroad and throwing abroad out. And I think we're going to be in this for quite some time.
Thank you, Andres. Before we go to the audience, I want to come back, and since we were talking about Trump, I mean, everyone saw the pictures of the Oval Office incident. I mean, how do you come back from that and say, we're going to continue to do business with this country, with this individual? And I'm talking about with the South African president.
Sure. First and foremost, I think we need to appreciate that South Africa's relations with the US cannot in many ways begin and end with President Trump. Citizens in South Africa look west. They are connected to the US. There's a lot of bilateral trade that takes place between South Africa and the US. There's an interest in being able to ensure that over a long period of time that relationship remains in place. And I think as we sit, even just as a country, having observed what was going on, some of the views that are put forward are not views that are representative of all of South Africans. There are South Africans who certainly think that it's important to keep that relationship on the go, to ensure that things like AGOA, let me give you a real practical example. If you take the PEPFAR funding, which is a $4 billion funding, I chair the budget committee, and the only compensation South Africa has been able to put forward is 750 million rand. Now, to replace billions with rands is hard work. So emanating from that meeting in the White House, I think what needs to happen is that South Africa, along with many other African states, need to continue to engage not only on issues of trade, but in figuring out, along with the US, how in the world where there are common interests that pertain to both countries and jurisdictions, there are points that are going to be different. But where there are points of common interest, we can work together. And maybe health is maybe but one example, but I use that as an example because disease don't have passports. Trade is another area. The relationships that we have around the Atlantic are key areas. So what are the long-term issues if you're willing to strip aside some of that? But the only other thing I would want to say is that the point that has been made about what are we doing around issues of self-interest, that Africa needs to be able to articulate that so that in arriving within a context, whether it be the US, whether it be the EU, whether it be China, who have their interests in Africa, that South Africa's interests are not subordinated from that. That we are able to have a genuine conversation about some of our exports to the US in the agricultural sector, or to China, or to anywhere else. Or how do we look at what some of the fundamental minerals and the programs of the future look like? And I think sometimes Africa, we arrive at the conversation not always with the gravity to say our interests are X. Now, let me use one last example. You mentioned the issue of energy. You can walk out of a climate summit that compels you to stop using coal.
Exactly.
South Africa's 70% of its energy is coal-driven. How do I wake up in the morning and suspend that, tie my hands and fail to build coal power stations or build power stations, whereas I'm watching other European jurisdictions refire their coal power plants at the expense of South Africa's own development? So these are the contradictions that sit. So in a world of realpolitik, I would want to argue that perhaps the future pathway we need to find is how do we deal with regions, regionalism, where ultimately interests that are shared. For example, if I'm to be energy secure and diverse, I must be conscious of the fact that there are areas around me that have gas, that have got other type of energy supply that South Africa doesn't have, and we have an opportunity to exchange. I would certainly hope that in a globalized universe, if we could be able to define our interests, we could be able to equally so understand what US's interests are and have a better dialogue than a dialogue that is born sometimes on facts that are not always consistent.
But the 20% or so of the folks in the audience, do you think that they don't fully understand the situation on the ground? So they think that Africa can and should, do things on its own.
I think perhaps maybe the 20% in the audience are asking, what are the things that Africa can do on their own that they are not? I don't think the 20% in the audience, I don't want to speak on behalf of the audience, I don't necessarily believe they are isolationists in that sense, saying we will annex Africa out of it, because it's just simply unrealistic. It's not going to happen. But what are the things that we need to be doing? Another example that I would sit back with. When I was traveling here from South Africa, I had to start in Paris. Now, I'm inspired when I hear that there are airlines that are already been built within the continent that make it easier for us to travel within the continent. That is something we could do together. What infrastructure are we building within the continent that makes sure there's better connectivity, better supply of goods? If it's hard for me as a person, as a passenger, to travel to Morocco, how much more is it for a pair of jeans or other minerals? Let's make that possible as an infrastructure build so that we can respond by saying, these are the things that in preserving our self-interest we can do. I raised the question of debt earlier, and there's a debate about whether should Africa have its own ratings agency, and other people are arguing the case whether will anyone listen to it or not. Now, well within the capital market, if we're able to price what is invested in the continent accurately as a reflection of the continent, these are some of the things we could do together. So I guess my argument is to the 20% or the 20% in the audience, we have more to do together that we have not been doing, and that's the work we should be focused on.
I know Andres wants to get involved, but also who has questions? Okay, my gosh. So we'll start here. Andres, if you can be quick with your,
I'll
get a mic.
I'll be
please.
quick, John.
Thank you.
I just want to
We'll start here.
point out one thing. You ask about Africa. What is Africa? Africa is a collection geographic collection of countries. Latin America is a geographic collection of countries. Europe is a geographic collection of countries. There is no such thing as a single Africa or a single Latin America, and that's where the multilateralism à la carte comes in. It's also where you have to deal with your self-interest. There are obviously issues that South Africa or Benin or Morocco have that are not necessarily shared by the others. And I think that putting the question as just one Africa doesn't really make a lot of sense in the world that we're living in.
No, that's a fair point. The only thing I'd say then is Bafana do play Mexico at the World Cup, so I'll see you there.
Yes, but we'll win, so don't worry.
Okay, before we get too deeply into sports, let's get some comments from the ground.
My name is Marcus Freitas from Senior Fellow here at the Poly Center. I think that one of the challenges we face is, and I come from Brazil, right? We're always looking north for certain examples. Mercosur tried to repeat the European Union, right? And we see many of these agreements that we try to reproduce what we see in the north. But perhaps it would be time for Africa to look east. Look at ASEAN, for instance, a group of developing countries that managed to grow intensively and with very good results. And it's an association that started very humbly, having just an idea. Development first, narratives later. And that's what I think we need to do. Forget Trump, forget the European Union. Let's look into possibilities of developing situations that other people are doing. And just to clarify, 80% of the trade that ASEAN does with China is manufactured products. So that people say that China only buys primary goods, 80% is manufactured products from ASEAN countries, which 20 years ago were not that relevant internationally. So I think that's what we need to find out. What is the real interest that you have? Start with a small association. Look east. North is not going to come to rescue, and what we have from the north is not really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll take several comments, and then we'll go here. And if there's anyone from the east, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So.
Thank you. Fernando Cardoso, Lisboa. My point is that our reaction depends on our expectations. So I'm also an African. I'm coming from Mozambique. There in Mozambique, we don't look north, we look south to this guy in Mozambique. He knows that. And it's not only Mozambique. So my point is that we in Africa, and this is a question, in Africa, we have the Lagos Plan of Action. We have the Abuja Treaty. And everybody is copying from Europe the concept of regional economic integration. And everybody in Africa continues, mostly in West Africa, continues to speak about regional economic integration. This is the question. The point is that the African states are not integrated. So, and people in Niger will not talk to the United States or to South Africa or to Europe. They will talk to the government of Niger. So the point is that the integration that Africa needs is national integration and, of course, cooperation. Because if we don't think this way, in 20 years' time, we will be saying that, well, we are not being able to get regional economic integration. Of course, because we first need to understand that national economic integration comes first for everybody that lives in that country. I agree with common positions. I agree with the regional positions, etc., etc., etc. But we have to look at national also.
Terrific. Let's take two more comments from the floor, and then we'll. I want to get you next, but first we'll get you, and then we'll get you. Okay. I'm sorry. Please.
Okay. Landry Signé, Policy Center for the New South and Brookings. So I think I can do a long dissertation. So my most recent book, Realizing Africa Potential, cover the topic. So just to be brief, one of the biggest challenge is the question of the political economy. African leaders, most of the African leaders are among the smartest people when you engage, you have one-on-one. The solution have been known, and in many of my previous books also I have covered from the pre-colonial era to date. We have the Kwame Nkrumah, etc. So many of the ideas which are discussed now, it's not just that Africa is looking for a solution outside. Many of the endogenous solutions have been taught also before. But the biggest challenge is how to bridge the gap between the wonderful idea and just successful implementation in a disruptive way, as also mentioned yesterday by Professor Lopez. I will stop there, but I have so much to say about this, but let's not take longer.
Thank you, and we'll read. What's the name of your book? Realizing Africa's Potential. Okay.
Thank you very much. El Mustafa Bin Lamli, again, United Nations. I'm one of those who voted yes. The 20%. I meant that the ownership should be African. The ownership should be African. We should not become a corridor of somebody else. And if the times now are changing, this is our opportunity as Africans to develop something. We have to start doing it. We can start with policies or economics, but we have to start doing it. We have to own it. Yes, we cannot do it by ourselves. We are part of this global world. And this global world is different from the global world we had before COVID. What did COVID tell us? Is that global mobility has ended. And we cannot have chain values that are global. We should have chain values that are regional, within hubs, that are interconnected. And we have to think about it. So, no other option than taking the opportunity offered by the changing times now. We have an opening. 2 years, 3 years, 20 years, it depends what we're going to do now. And an opening to develop as an autonomous hub, not a corridor. This is related to the other case. I'll take a little bit longer. To the other case. West Asia, which is the Middle East and Iran and so on, can become just a corridor. If we think of the IMEC, India, Middle East corridor, no, West Asia can become independent hub, just like India and China with the region and the global south, not the Atlantic. Why this? I think we have a lot of dividends. We have the demographics, we mentioned it, young. We have the institutional flexibility. If you want to change something in Brussels, in Belgium, it will take you a lot of time because the institutions are rigid, costly. You cannot change it easily. In Africa, institutions are still young and flexible. Reform in Africa is easier and cheaper than elsewhere. There is also the diversity. It's good to have South Africa, Uganda, Angola, Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria. These are not competing. These are strengths, if we can use them. Very quickly, resources and untapped resources. Untapped resources. Let's go back to COVID. When COVID came, all of a sudden, here in Morocco, we discovered that we have young people, entrepreneurs, who can do a lot of things if they're given the opportunity. I was wishing and hoping at that time that that mentality would continue. It did not. That untapped resources, we have them. In Nairobi, we have them in Cote d'Ivoire, we have them in Abuja, we have them in Tunisia, we have them in Egypt. Last point. We are not starting today. There's Tangimed, There is the corridor, Lubato corridor. There is the Nigeria, Morocco. There are many, many initiatives. We have to build on this. Last thing, last one. The real last one. I served in Malawi, served in Cote d'Ivoire, in Sudan, in Egypt, in Morocco, and other places. I served in the 90s, and I know what's happening today. There is a big difference. There is a big trend, positive trend, that we don't see because we are here in Morocco and we are in South Africa. But when you live it, there are big trends positive. In the 90s, we have the Mano River. Nobody spoke about that area. It was a lot of trouble. Now things will get better, and I think we have to believe in it, own it, and do it. We don't have any other option. We can become just a corridor of other people coming and saying we are helping.
Great, thank you. Next year, we'll have to get you on the panel. You ready? Please.
Good afternoon. Fatma Jabi from the Gambia, PhD candidate, UMC SPE. I just wanted to piggyback on what the kind sir from South Africa said about confidence in ourselves. I think it's really, really important, the narrative about colonization. Yes, we need to accept that it happened. Yes, but how can we move forward? I think that is something that we need to ask. We need to also believe in the African expertise that we have, Africans ourselves, because maybe it's floating around here. Someone needs to do a study about how confident are Africans in African expertise when it comes to this. And we cannot, it's certain, let's say, especially with the coups that are happening right now, you have military leaders that are taking populist narratives about blaming the West, the West, yes. Okay, when we get to a world where Africa is no longer dealing majoritarily with the West, but we have diverse partnerships, how will the narratives change? Would we still continue to blame the same people, or do we have to strap our boots and get to work? I think that's what we are missing, and we need to start thinking about it now.
Great, thank you. Now, we've had a lot of interventions from the audience. We'll get some quick responses from the panel, about 30, 40 seconds each, if you can. And then we'll come back to the audience because there are a lot of people who want to have their questions asked, or in some cases, their opinions heard. And if you can keep those questions and opinions really briefly, we can get a lot more people in. So back to the panel, please.
No, firstly, I really appreciate the inputs that have been made, and there are lots to respond to. Suffice to say, I think I agree with you. This is not just one singular Africa. There are many dynamics in it. But what I think needs to be said is there are common areas of which we share strong interests. It's important for Africa to work on its education agenda to make sure it's a skilled continent. It's important that without obsessing on what COVID has meant but in responding to how we manage disease. And that's not creating patents only for vaccines, but it's also making sure that every African country has got testing protocols, all of those, and funding for it. It's also important that we create, and we've got agencies that are funding development, and how do we introduce capital in many projects that are taking place in the continent. It's also important that on areas of cooperation, we can be, on a basic level, someone raises the point about dictatorships that are coming on board. Part of why there's an appeal to dictatorships is that sometimes the bureaucracy has been modeled after a distant world in Africa, that sometimes in decision making, it takes too long to execute on decisions, that people have an appetite for dictators who can make quick decisions so that action can take place. The job we've got to do, no, let me just say this, just one thing. The job we have to do as Africans is ask for a better caliber of leadership that is thinking about how to build bureaucracies that can execute with speed in a world that is fast changing and responding to speed. That's the job we've got to do. And that's all I'm asking for.
Thank you, Musi. Others on the panel who want to intervene? Peter?
Yeah, just a lot of rich points. Well, just one. Going back to our conversations about self-interest, I think the other part, the flip side of the other kind of implicit kind of judgment made in some of the initial questions about transactionalism is, I think it goes against the realpolitik that we've talked about. And part of the realpolitik is dealing with the world as you find it and not trying to impose. I thought one of the most beautiful sentences in foreign policy recently was the very first sentence in the new U.S. national security strategy, the very first sentence in the section on Africa. And it actually says, for too long, American policy in Africa has been about providing and, more lately, spreading liberal ideology. And goes on to explicitly disavow that. That is not in America's own self-interest to be spreading and imposing its own cultural norms, which are contested in our own country, and being judged by. And interestingly, just this week, on Wednesday, the United States, one of the countries that had been cut off from assistance in recent years because of a diversity agenda pushed by the previous administration, was Uganda. Uganda, on 2 days ago, signed with the U.S. a 5-year, $1.7 billion partnership, $1.7 billion, where the U.S. will partner with $500 million that Uganda will raise on its own to invest in the health sector. That would have been unthinkable just over a year ago. And so it's a transaction. American pharmaceuticals and companies will benefit, but so will Uganda's health sector. And it's founded upon mutual interests and not lectures from Washington that wouldn't even pass in our own heartland.
Great, thank you, Peter. Natalie, I don't know if you want to get in here, or should we just go back to the audience?
No, it's fine. Just to make the point again about the importance of continental integration, because Africa once again is a huge continent. It is 54 different countries, but that's exactly what makes its wealth. And I think that without integration, Africa won't be strong. So we need to work, as you said, on continental infrastructure, on mobility within Africa, making the point that Africa need to invest in Africa. It doesn't add that for the time being only 14% of FDI in Africa are African. That's not enough. It's not enough to have only 40% of trade, intra-trade in Africa compared to what's the case in Europe. So I don't totally agree that we can't talk about one Africa. I think it's important to see Africa as a huge continent as it is. And my other point also on vaccine, I think it's important to build some kind of strategic autonomy when it comes to health. And I think that a good side effect, if I may say so, of COVID is the fact that indeed African countries came together, and it was extremely interesting to see what African Union was able to put together at that time to build some kind of autonomy when it comes to vaccine and medical products, and that European Union came behind to foster and strengthen this initiative. I don't think, what I agree with you is it doesn't make sense that each of the 54 countries are going to build their own vaccine autonomy. There needs to be some hubs. But there is a way in between, nothing at continental level and nothing at national level.
Great, thank you, Natalie. We'll take some more questions. I think we've got one here, and then we have a few over there. Over here. And,
hello.
If you can.
Yes, thank you. Halim El-Joundi, researcher from Morocco. I'll use African countries instead of Africa because Africa is no monolith. And you asked, should African countries navigate alone? Shouldn't we ask, can African countries be allowed to navigate alone? Means choosing with whom they want to work and do business and under which circumstances and terms. And also a small thought about the victimization narrative. In itself, it's no good, but it's very important to state facts, keep the memory alive, because it will give us direction.
Okay, great, thank you. There are a couple of questions there, if we can get those, and please keep your interventions brief. We've got a lot of people who want to
Thank you. Lawe Jala is my name, Hillside University of Science and Technology, Nigeria. Africa should stop whining. Honestly, if we don't help ourselves, nobody's going to come and help us. When Morocco and Nigeria agreed to work on the fertilizer deal, it was done among Africans. Aliko Dangote, OCP, and Co got together and they work. Together, for a long time in Nigeria, we looked for Europe, everybody to help us refine our crude oil. They didn't show up. Just about 2-3 years ago, Aliko started it, and it's working. It's changing things. He just signed a deal with Ethiopia, and it's going around. South Africa, you were there to help Zimbabwe and Co were with you, but we start fighting ourselves. Unless and until we do the things we need to do by ourselves, nobody will look to us. Resources are scarce. Europe is fighting among themselves. They're challenged by their resources. They are not going to be charity to us. And all we tell everybody is, it's not about aid, it's about trade. But we need to show amongst ourselves that we know what we want to do, and we start at it, and more people will join us.
Terrific. Thank you. It's another question here, and then we'll go over here. Please.
Thank you, John. Mina Baliamun, Policy Center for the New South and University of North Florida. My comment is related to regional integration. We tend to always say, okay, when regional integration, we're waiting for governments to do things. And yes, for many things, we need authorization of government, we need constitutions to change, laws to change, and everything. But there is nothing that prevents. There are 3 main airlines in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. There is Royal Air Maroc, and I'm not necessarily in this order, but Royal Air Maroc, South African Airways, and Ethiopian Airways, right? They don't connect to each other. Sorry?
Kenyan Airways.
And Kenya, yeah, of course. Sorry about that. Yeah, of course I flew it. So anyway, what they can do is bypass whatever their governments have against each other, right? Fly to countries where they all fly to, and then do code-sharing. You don't have to go through Europe to do that, because he mentioned that he had to go through Europe to come to Morocco. But if the private sector start things like these, governments will have to follow sooner or later. But if we wait for lots of things to start at the political level, they might not start. That's my take on it. Thank you.
There's, let's not forget Kenyans. There's a question over here. We'll do that. And then
Thank you
we'll
very much. And I'm not Kenyan, I'm just an African. By the way, I'm Vemba Pezo Dizolele. I'm the chairman, CEO of Africa Dizolele Advisory in Washington, D.C. Pleasure to be here. So the fundamental problem we have, I think, that we have skirted for 65 years is the state, the nature of the state. The state is a colonial structure that was left behind, not for integration, not for cross-border, to serve Rome. We used to say, touche même à Rome, when we were kids. In other words, all the roads in Bamako, in Mali, lead to Paris. All the roads in Kinshasa leads to Hoboken in Belgium for the refinery of copper. So the president is exactly the same guy or the same attribute as the governor general used to have. And then we expect different results in these countries. For 65 years, we've avoided the major project, which is restructuring the state so it's responsive internally. So it's not an extension of the colonial power, which has become the international order now. It's still the same structure. So until we do that, I think we'll continue to have an AU that doesn't work, which I think should close and go home, so that we have the time to rethink what is exactly the role of a state. Take country X, take country Y, it's the same problem. So it's totally normal that coups will come back, and we're experiencing those, because the states are not delivering. This is not a normative position, whether you believe in coups or don't believe in coups. The system is going to continue to fail, because the system was not built to address the people. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a young man over there who had a question. There we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Damlola Balogun from Nigeria, and I work actively in the energy transition space. My question really is that, of course, we know that a lot of the critical minerals needed to power the global energy transition lies in Africa. And while a lot of value addition is still done outside of the African continent, right? The important thing for us really is that how do we position these resources to prevent another extractive cycle, such that we use these resources to power Africa and use it to command the level of industrialization that we deserve. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I regret to inform you that we have just time for 2 more interventions. We'll take, and then we'll take yours.
Francisco Cordova, emerging new leader from Colombia. And in the chapter I wrote why we cannot have unlimited energy and water for Africa and Latin America. Mademoiselle said that 600 million Africans lack access to electricity, correct? And do you know that in Africa, if we just put enough solar panels, we can have all the energy for the whole world? And in Africa, we have 38 nations that have access to the ocean, so you can put desalination plants. And if you check the example of what happened to Cape Town with the 0-day hour, where they almost run out of water, even though you're surrounded by water. So the key question, and the question for the leaders, is if we have the capacity, now the cost to create electricity is going extremely down, and to transform the water from the sea into potable water, why are not we doing it?
Okay, great, thank you. We'll take your question.
Yeah, very quickly. I think what was very good with this panel is the frankness that took place, and our brother from South Africa was quite clear about the next move that we need to have. This is my 5th Atlantic Dialogue, and I think the good thing with this platform is in what extent, what's the takeaway to action? Because at the end of the day, I think that's what motivates the money and the time that's spent. My suggestion would be working from policy to action. And the policy to action, for me, in terms of the regional integration, accelerating the regional integration, is through how do you move from those policy discussions, at least in Africa, to get capital. Because at the end of the day, apart from the knowledge, which I think is quite well mapped out, is capital. And the capital should lead us to cooperation. One concrete example is OCP. What OCP has done in really mastering the whole value from phosphate to become what the company is today. We need to replicate identical experience in all sectors, because we need big corporations in Africa that will accelerate the regional integration. That doesn't mean that the SME is not important, but you need some big companies who can pull out those small ones. And for a word of context, you're totally right about the issue of the one voice. But the context of the one voice came from the independence movement. That was an excellent platform that our founding father have created to liberate the continent. And we still have. So I think my suggestion is to move from slogan to concrete cooperation, how to replicate identical experience in many sectors. The case, for example, on airline, as my sister from Morocco was saying, Askai, apart from Kenya Airways and Ethiopian Airlines,
unfortunately,
is the most profitable airline that we have now in Africa, and it has been created for a group of countries, and that's how you move from, as you said, from the discourse on regional integration to concrete company that could help accelerate the regional integration.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate all their interactions from the audience. What we're going to do next, if you can go back to your app, please. There is a question about whether Africa should navigate alone. I want to see if you can please go back and answer that question again, and we'll see if there have been any change. Now we'll have the panel have about 30 seconds each to wrap up. And we'll start with Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just say this, I agree with those several sentiments issue, saying that this is a moment. The window is not going to be open forever. It's a narrow one. Seize the opportunity to identify those strategic self-interests, to leverage those in dialogue with other partners, because I still believe in the no answer there, that you cannot go alone, and to achieve a true, mutually beneficial, it's an opportunity. It's not going to come again that quickly necessarily, or may not come again in the same form. So history doesn't wait. So seize the opportunity sees the strategic agency that's offered, and let's see what can be done with it.
Natalie, thank you, Peter. Natalie?
Yeah, I would say navigating is not an option. It's the direction of travel. We have to.
Okay, you've got it. You can talk.
Yeah, to navigate. Second, interests, as you said, are not necessarily a dirty word, but they need to be articulated and shared. And I'm coming back just to your question. This is a matter for transaction. How do we use our critical minerals? You want my critical minerals, I want local transformation. How can we make a deal on that?
Great.
I think it's a way of doing that. And last, I would say that Africa has made the main keys to navigate this difficult world: natural resources, space, and last but not least, youth. Youth. I think this is the key asset of the African continent in this otherwise aging world.
Great, thank you, Natalie. We'll go to Andres.
Well, I think from the poll, obviously, we haven't changed a lot of minds. Everybody is exactly where they were when we started. But what I think has been very rich in the discussion is that there are multiple ways in which Africa or African countries can do things on their own, and there are others where probably it's more difficult. I come from a region which has tried to integrate itself for several centuries, and we've never been able to do it. We have a common language, basically, except for one of the countries that speaks a close relative to our common language. And we, we look at Africa and we look at the 54 countries and we say, gosh, there are various languages, the geography is not helpful for integration. But at the same time, and I think Peter insists on it, which is good, that a la carte multilateralism works. And the example of the airline is that. That's a multilateral a la carte decision to do something together, which works better than if you do it alone.
Okay. Great. And Musi, we'll have you wrap up the conversation.
I think we've got to answer the basic question: what is Africa's organizing mission? Everyone has raised demographic opportunity. There's a lesson to learn from China in that a number of decades ago, people looked at China in some way, some of the same way they look at Africa. This is a backward place and they've got problems. And yet today we've got an opportunity. So for me, here's an organizing mission that I'd put on this dialogue. If there's going to be, and different numbers have been bandied about, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, the only organizing question is how do we move 300 million of those people from poverty to the middle class? That's not a response only for government, that's a response for industry, that's a response for every sector of society. If we fail at that mission, the reality of it is that we will never even bother to go at it alone. We'll be globally dependent. So let's own our problems, which I like what he said, own the solutions, but the major issue here is that how do we shift people who are below the poverty line to the middle class? We get 300 million there, everybody contributes towards that, then I think we can talk about how do we regionalize, integrate, multilateralism, and all of the above.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking this great panel.
Panelists are asked to remain on stage for a group photo.